Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Kiana Rauji. I'm a first year at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In an event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Chaplain Khalil Abdur-Rashid, Father J. Bryan Hehir, Brittany Packnett, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, Reverend Cornell William Brooks, and Director of the Institute of Politics, Mark D. Guerin.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Kiana, for the introduction, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School. We warmly welcome all of our students and faculty colleagues and staff and guests. Special greetings to Dean Elmendorf of the Kennedy School and the Divinity School, Dean David Hempton. And we warmly welcome back President Backo's Chief of Staff and Strategic Advisor, Patty Bellinger. Welcome back. We should give Patty a shout out here. Tonight we have a very interesting conversation with the title Moral Resistance, with faith and activism meets in the streets. And I'm very grateful to our moderator tonight, Cornell Brooks, who came to us with this very good idea. Cornell wanted to bring together faith leaders and those involved in great movements over time and currently, and look at this intersection between faith and activism. And we know through history that has marked our history with great movements, great leaders from the faith community have inspired, have engaged, have consoled activists in those movements. So this is a really important topic for here at the Institute of Politics in these times especially. So with gratitude to Cornell for this idea and for moderating, we have put together a terrific group that Cornell will introduce. But we couldn't have a better moderator than Cornell Brooks, who brings to this perspective his own life of consequence as a fourth generation ordained minister, as a lawyer, as an activist himself, CEO and president of the NAACP, and now, fortunately for all of us here at the Kennedy School, professor here and engaged with the Center for the Center for Public Leadership. So he brings all those perspectives in his role, and so we're grateful to that. As I said, he will introduce our panel, but allow me the personal privilege to welcome back to the Institute of Politics our most recent resident fellow, Brittany Packnett. Welcome back.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Cornell.
Well, first of all, let me just say good evening and thank you to all of you for braving the elements on a sultry, warm winter evening to be here at the Kennedy School. And I also want to ask you to join me in expressing appreciation, first of all, to Mark Guerin, who leads the Institute of Politics here, to my colleague, Wendy Sherman, who leads the Center for Public Leadership, and the founding director of the Center for Public Leadership, David Gergen, who I think is in the house somewhere, and also the dean of the Kennedy School, Doug Elmendorf, who did not frown when I mentioned the possibility of this forum. I also want to call upon you to express appreciation to the Harvard Chaplains, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and the Harvard Divinity School. And by appreciation, I mean put your hands together. Now, it's my honor to introduce new friends and old friends in this work of moral resistance. Let me just note parenthetically that we are holding this conversation, this convening in the midst of a Twitter age, if you will, of social justice in this country. It is a moment of generationally unprecedented activism. And whether you're talking about civil disobedience campaigns from Ferguson to Flint, from Philadelphia to Chicago, from New York City to small towns and communities all across this country, we find people of conscience and conviction and communities of faith on the front line, marching, demonstrating, protesting, getting arrested, wearing their theology, their social ethics, if you will, on their sleeves, on their hearts, and on their bodies. And so with that said, we have this wonderfully diverse, inspired, and inspiring panel. I want to introduce my new colleague, Khalil Abdur-Rashid, who is the first full-time university Muslim chaplain here at Harvard University. Having held a similar post at Columbia, he serves all Muslim students at Harvard, supervises the staff of the Harvard University Office of the Chaplain. He was born and raised down south in Atlanta, where I hail from. He pursued a master's degree in comparative Islamic law at Marmara University and completed 2 Islamic seminary doctoral licenses in Islamic sciences, holds a Master of Arts in Islamic law and Middle East studies, and a Master of Philosophy in Islamic law. He's held posts at Columbia, taught at NYU, and he is currently pursuing, if 2 doctorates were not enough, an academic doctorate in liberal studies. And I believe his wife is here on the front row.
That's right.
Okay. My colleague, new colleague in the Kennedy School, Father Brian Hehir, is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life. He's also the Secretary of Health and Social Services on the staff of Cardinal Sean O'Malley for the Archdiocese of Boston. He served on the faculty of the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, on the Harvard Divinity School, chair of the HDS committee. He was also formerly president of Catholic Charities USA. He's a recipient of the MacArthur Award and the American Academy of Religion's Martin E. Marty Award. He is a phenomenal leader and a veteran of many, many movements. Brittany Packnett, who I met in the White House via Ferguson, is someone whom I've admired for a long time. She has been described by President Obama as a leader whose voice is going to make a difference for years to come. The president, then president, was speaking prospectively, but he could have been speaking retrospectively. She's a former teacher, policy expert, and a nonprofit executive director. She's committed her life to social justice. That is a young life, but firmly dedicated. She serves as a vice president for Teach for America. She was a Ferguson protester. She leads Campaign Zero. She also hosts Pod Save the People. She's a graduate of the Washington University in St. Louis. And for those of you who are consumers of public media, she's been on a number of magazine covers from Essence to Time, and she's here tonight. Lastly, I want to introduce a really good friend of mine, someone with whom I've walked literally from Selma to D.C., Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who serves as vice president for the Union, I should say, for the Reform Action Center of the Union of Reform Judaism in Washington, D.C., which is the legislative arm of the Union of Reform Judaism. These are they who have marched and demonstrated in many of the greatest protest movements of our time. He was a leader here in Massachusetts, leading on health care. There's not a significant public policy fight in terms of social justice where Jonah has not shown up and represented. So can you put your hands together for tonight's panel? So the first question really goes to the heart of where we find ourselves as a country. And it comes out of a little experience I had in Ferguson when, after Michael Brown was killed, we had a community forum in a church. And a young man said to me, packed church, he said, "Why are you holding this meeting in this place when so many people don't feel comfortable here?" So the first question for the panel is, where many of us represent traditions that we believe represent love and inclusion, How do we show up in places where those faith traditions symbolize and can trigger feelings of hate and even exclusion, or perceptions of hate and exclusion? Jonah, since I'm looking at you, you go first.
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to Cornell William Brooks, who is an incredible leader. He's prophetic, he is rabbinic, he is wise, and he's all of our teachers. So can we celebrate Dr. Reverend Cornell William Brooks? And thank you, of course, to the Kennedy School, to the Institute of Politics. And Mom, if you're watching, I got into Harvard. At least I got in. So the origin, I think, of the kind of audacious hospitality of Jewish tradition anyway, which I think is shared by the Muslim and Christian faith as well, is found in this early but master narrative of Abraham and Sarah, who many of the panelists and people in the room will remember, sat in their tent in the wilderness with the tent flaps open in all four directions, north, east, south, and west, so that anybody seeking anything would find refuge and comfort. And they famously, Sarah greeted the three strangers who appeared mysteriously out of nowhere with water and with food. That master narrative of inclusion, of audacious hospitality, guides the Reformed Jewish movement, but I think it guides many of our movements as we realize sometimes church doesn't happen in the building. And forgive me as a Jew talking about where church happens, right? But shul isn't always Saturday morning at the temple. Right. Sometimes it's when we're marching with the Torah from Selma to Washington, D.C. There were many more spiritual moments that happened on that march as there are sometimes in the formal liturgy. So I think partly being in the streets is about meeting people where they are and having the Torah of real people's lives.
Father Hehir, you being the youngest activist here.
Well, I think the inclusiveness begins with the understanding of God. God is universally inclusive. God's a mystery, meaning not that he's unintelligible, but is so deeply intelligible we never fully master the mystery. And part of the mystery of God is precisely God's inclusiveness. The beginning of social justice for me begins with the Hebrew Scriptures. It begins with Genesis. And Genesis, I always say, should never be taken literally, but it should be taken seriously. Because the way Genesis functions in the opening chapter is that God creates the world the way you write a symphony. There's a kind of rising crescendo as you move from darkness to light, to life that is vegetative and animal. And then at the very pinnacle of God's action, God says, like unto me, I will make them, man and woman, like unto me. That consecrates every single person. God has designated it so. Now, religious traditions never fully reflect the universality of God. We try, but we are reminded by Reinhold Niebuhr that the only Christian doctrine for which there's empirical evidence is original sin. And therefore, inclusiveness is a lifelong journey for individuals and for religious communities. But as long as we keep our eye on that Genesis text, then we know what kind of inclusiveness needs to be our goal, our method, and our constant journey. And every time we fall short, we go back to the inclusive God in prayer, asking forgiveness and empowerment that we might reflect his vision in our time.
Mm-hmm. Brittany, would you speak to that? I mean, your hometown was the genesis of that question.
Yeah, I remember those meetings, and are you talking about Tommy Pearson's church?
Yeah, it was like maybe the second day after Michael Brown was killed?
Yeah. I know what church you're talking about. So that was a smaller church, but there was a larger church that was right on the edge of Ferguson, a few minutes away from the church you're talking about, where that was much larger, where a lot of the meetings during and after the marches would take place. And marches is probably too formal a term, because folks from my study group last semester know that what existed in Ferguson was incredibly organic. So there was no institution, religious or otherwise, that started that movement, that uprising. It was people coming out of their homes and saying enough is enough, and refusing to go back inside their homes, especially when their streets and their neighborhoods began to face police occupation. And so we would walk up and down the street, because what a lot of people also don't realize is that there was a time during which we were told it was illegal to stand still in Ferguson. Literally, standing still for more than 5 seconds would get you arrested. Of course, that is unconstitutional, and the lawsuit later brought that to bear. But for several weeks, we would have to march in circles. And so the only place where we could be stationary and actually meet and organize and talk were often in churches. And so what would happen is we would march in circles, and then eventually the young people would lead us into the church. And you would have hundreds, if not 1,000 people inside the church, but you'd have hundreds of people outside of the church. Yeah. And it wasn't because we were lacking room, it was because people were feeling unwelcome. Yeah. Later on in what we call Ferguson October, we had actual freedom rides, buses full of people coming from around the country to Ferguson. And when several of the churches that had agreed to host those freedom riders found out that there were LGBTQ and in particular trans people on those buses, they then refused to house those folks that were coming to help us. So the feelings of exclusion, I just wanted to be clear, are rooted in something very real, right? It is not imagined. And I am the child of not one but two preachers, which means I had no excuse but to be in the life, okay? And my brother's a minister, so like I'm the heathen that's left. But I found myself. I barely escaped. I found myself having a crisis of faith right before Ferguson, and actually became much more rooted once again in my faith during the uprising. Number one, because when you literally don't know if you're going to live through the night, there is nobody to rely on but your creator. But number two, because I watched a woman named Tracy Blackman, who is a pastor in the UCC tradition. Yes, Pastor Tracy, she's phenomenal. And I watched her come to a reckoning with this exact question. And she was confused as to why young people were not willing to come into the church, why people were not willing to come into the church for organizing meetings and all of these other things. And I kept telling her, I said, part of the issue here is that you all keep trying to lead. And I understand that that is what you have to do every single week, every single day with your congregation. But young people are already leading, so all you have to do is follow. And if you come in trying to take over, you're going to continue to be dismissed. And so she was one of the first clergy members that actually really got that. And so there was a march that happened later on in the week. During the day, that was a bit more peaceful, so folks kind of all ages could come. And we marched into Canfield, and we literally created a circle of thousands of people right around the spot where Michael Brown had been killed and had laid slain for 4.5 hours. And she got on a bullhorn and she said, I have to apologize to you, because here we were thinking that we needed you to come to the church, but actually we needed to bring the church to you. And that was the moment of transformation. That was the moment when people said, here I can find myself and see myself in this place with you, that you will not exclude me, that you will not dictate how I have to show up in your space, that who I have to be in order to show up in your space. And so that stance of humility, which is deeply religious, her as a clergy member deciding to assume that stance of humility was one that set a model for fellow clergy, and also I think started to open the doors, at least to the conversation, if not to collective work.
So, Mom, you've been really a clerical pioneer on a couple of campuses, and you're dealing with these questions of inclusion and exclusion. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think, from from an Islamic point of view, the challenge of exclusion and inclusion and being able to navigate that challenge and gradually open the door for more inclusion and to reduce the amount of exclusion is the paradigmatic challenge of the human being. From an Islamic point of view, the human being's primary struggle is to struggle against notions of superiority, dominance, and power that put one person over another. And there are a variety of ways that we do that in our daily lives, in our professions. There are a variety of ways that we teach intentionally and unintentionally modes of superiority and dominance and authority and control to our children, to students, etc. And so while there's a process of growth that entails self-esteem, building up a human being, making a person, a young person, a student, feel proud of who they are, there's also simultaneously the task of instilling in that young person a sense of indebtedness to society, so that the person doesn't go out thinking that they control society. Mm-hmm. And that becomes, from an Islamic perspective, the goal of what we call spiritual transformation. That the purpose is to, over time, grow to the understanding that we as human beings are not here to be subjugated by other human beings. That we as human beings are here to help each other grow and develop, but we encounter institutions of power. We encounter attitudes of power. We encounter discourses of power. And when those encounters happen, then we have a responsibility to push back against that. And pushing back against that involves speaking truth to power. It involves speaking up, standing up, showing up. And there's a very famous verse in the Muslim Holy Scripture which says, in the Quran, which says, when you're asked, O people of faith, when you're asked to make space in your places, make space in your places. And when you're asked to rise to the occasion, rise to the occasion. And so that is what I have found is sort of the core mantle and the core task of what, in my experience, I've seen as my job, and of other folks that have taken up the positions I've taken up with respect to being in positions of responsibility in mentoring students, to teach them that and to guide them and to help them understand the significance of making spaces, and number two, standing up and rising to the occasion, because we in the city, as products of the city, as agents in the city, we automatically encounter intersections of power and prestige, and we have to be very mindful about the effects of that. And being a person of faith means that we should be attuned to those intersections, and that we have to be very apt at checking ourselves and others when there are encroachments and abuse of power.
So, as we noted at the outset, this conversation occurs at a moment of unprecedented activism, but it is also a dangerous moment, right? So when we think about the fact that the hate crime rate has, as I like to put it, viciously vectored upward over the last 3 years, where we saw in 2018 50 people murdered by, not an ideological note here, but a descriptive note, by right-wing extremists, where we see on our Twitter feed on a near daily basis people's bodies and communities being brutalized. Activism is civic activity, but it's also dangerous activity. The question that I want to pose to you is, how do religious communities avoid being co-opted? In the wake of the Tree of Life massacre, religious folk were called upon to console the grieving. In the wake of the Emmanuel 9, religious folks were called upon to console the grieving. In Ferguson, religious and non-religious folk were called upon to console the grieving and restore the order. How do we move from being the first responders in terms of grief to being the primary care physicians in terms of prescriptive policy?
Well, I think it illustrates the ministry, whether the ministry is carried out in any one of our communities or communities that aren't represented here. Ministry means tending to the full range of human need. Mm-hmm. And therefore, ministry can't be pigeonholed. I mean, you're not a good pastor if you can do one thing well and you leave 5 things undone. On the other hand, you're not a good pastor if you try and do everything, because you'll probably do it superficially. So, I mean, there is a way in which what your question raises, I think, is how do you be attentive to, responsive to individuals as individuals, and at the same time have a vision of ministry, a theological and empirical vision that understands that individuals live within social structures and social systems, and that those structures and systems have needs too, and the need may be to correct them. I mean, the point is that in order to carry out this twofold work of sensitivity to the person and personal needs and addressing the social structural needs that surround us as a community. Now, people do it differently, I think, and most of our communities, I think, have both local settings where this becomes very dramatic. I mean, if you have a young person who's been killed on the streets of Boston, killed in Roxbury, you've got to be there for that family. But then you have to ask the question, why are there so many killings at Bowdoin and Geneva Street? We have an organization here called the Teen Center, which Catholic Charities sponsors at the intersection of Bowdoin and Geneva. It's been described as the most dangerous place in Boston. So you have to bury the dead with sensitivity, support the family, and then on the next day, when the funeral's over, you've still got to be dealing with the wider social system that produces that. Not everybody can do everything, right, but the church and the synagogue and the mosque have to measure their vision all the time between sensitivity to the person and strength in dealing with social structures, with a vision of justice that says we are constantly under judgment. You may think I only read the Hebrew scriptures, but besides Genesis, the other great text for me are the prophets. So the prophets were the conscience of Israel, and the prophets were the ones who dealt with the wider questions. In the temple, you may have to deal with the pastoral questions individually, but you've got to be able to do both if you're doing integral ministry.
It's interesting, you know, we were still in the middle of the Ferguson uprising, and I had become very reliant on the letter from a Birmingham jail for lots of reasons. But in that, I kind of went into a rabbit hole and started digging up all of this archival footage of the mid-century civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And I watched Dr. King tell several news folks who were asking him why he refused to go outside and settle everybody down. And I think that the short answer to your question is that there are just some invitations that we have to be willing to refuse. Mm-hmm. He said very clearly words that I said at 5 a.m. on Good Morning America the morning after Darren Wilson was not indicted. He said very clearly that a riot is the language of the unheard. Yep. He said very clearly to police chiefs who wanted him to come out and be the moral authority that they wanted him to be, that you cannot be more concerned with the outpouring of people's frustration than you are with the causes of their frustration. So there are just some invitations that we have to refuse. There are some requests that we have to say no to. That doesn't mean that we don't comfort grieving people, but we do that in the time and space and in the way that we deem appropriate. And it's funny because we would find ourselves, we being lots of us activists who have become known over the last few years, whenever there would be another killing and another extrajudicial killing of an unarmed black person by police, we would get calls or DMs, and we would get called to different places, or we would get asked for our advice. One of the very first pieces of advice I would give, in particular to clergy, is the police are going to ask you to go out there and calm the crowd. Say no. Because you have to recognize your own power in this moment. If you allow yourself to say yes, you will effectively undermine all of the work that is being done and all of the public pressure that's making them pay attention in the first place. Second of all, though, you can actually turn to them and say, I will not do that, but I will tell you the demands of our community. Because those police chiefs are willing to listen to those members of clergy when they're not willing to listen to those young people out in the street. So there are just some invitations that I think we have to say no to, and recognize the power of the ministry to push, to provoke. My father was a pastor of black church history and black liberation theology. So I never understood this Jesus that had been characterized in such a passive way. That was never the Jesus that I knew. Like, the Jesus I knew always was brown, had kinky hair, and was a troublemaker. That's the only one that I knew. To operate in that tradition, I think is what is the moment that we are in right now.
I agree with that. I would say a couple things too to build on what Brittany just shared. A mentor and teacher of mine in this work, Reverend Michael Ray Matthews, likes to posit to clergy. He's the deputy director of the Faith in Action, formerly known as PICO organization, and has done a lot of training of clergy around this. Is, do you want to be a chaplain to the regime or a prophet to the resistance? Do you want to be a chaplain to the regime or a prophet to the resistance? So I think one of the dangers is, particularly because I represent a denomination of religious life that skews towards the more suburban and the more affluent and the more comfortable, the comforting of people and the kind of consoling of people is the easy space for us to be in. The prophetic resistance is the more uncomfortable place, and it is the place where demand. So I want to just give two quick concrete examples. One is in the Ferguson. If Pastor Tracy were here hearing Brittany, she might lift up her best rabbi friend, Rabbi Susan Talvey, who's the rabbi of Central Reformed Congregation in St. Louis, who during one of the nights of unrest in St. Louis, there were kind of crowds gathering in the neighborhood of the synagogue, and the police were coming in and moving in. And so it was Friday night, which means it's the holiest day of the year, and services are about to begin, and Rabbi Talvey is asked by whatever voice was asking, what are we going to do? And without a whole lot of consultation, she flew open the doors and said to the activists, you belong in here with us to be safe. And young activists of color, many of whom had never stepped foot in a synagogue in their life, let alone engage in Shabbat worship, found refuge and sanctuary in that synagogue. I will tell you, that synagogue was alive in that moment. I don't know if people know the origin of the picture. I don't know, Cornell, William Brooks, how you know. So this is taken in Cleveland. This is the clergy of Greater Cleveland congregations. Rabbi Josh Caruso is a dear friend of mine. He's the Jewish one in the middle there with the yarmulke. And in it's the organization Greater Cleveland Congregations. They were on a march after the Tamir Rice murder and then the lack of police action. And this was kind of the combination of chaplaincy and prophetic resistance. They were out there in the streets with the crowds, but then leveraging their power to demand that the city of Cleveland obey the consent decree from the Department of Justice. Right. So there is a way to kind of lean into pastoring the streets and then being the prophetic resistance. And if we have more time, I'll share what I actually saw in Pittsburgh, but I take enough time for right now, but I will happily do that.
I think from our perspective, we've got to show up when it's not our issue. Too many times, we tend to show up if it's our issue, or if it's an issue that resonates with us for some matter of convenience. But we've got to do more to show up on universal issues. Right is right and wrong is wrong. And when we do that, when we stand for what's right because it's what's right, not because it's what's conveniently right, then that sends a message that is more powerful than any scripture that can be quoted, than any structure that can be built, and any slogan that could be ever tweeted or remembered. And then when we stand for what's right, then we speak from a platform of principle. And when we speak from a platform of principle, that has the ability to unite folks in many, many different ways and to create commonalities between people that previously might have seen division. So I was in North Dallas City once at a big protest against a funeral home, a cemetery. And this was in a high school. The room was packed with several hundred people, and all the media was there, and I was the lone representative speaking on behalf of the Muslim community, and the community there was against there being a Muslim cemetery because of certain issues. Long story short, a gentleman came up to me, and he had on, and I extended my hand to shake his hand, and he refused. And he said, you people should go back to where you came from. And I said, well, with all due respect, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. I don't have any intention of going back but to visit. But he was going back and forth and this, that, and the other. He had a cap on he was a World War II veteran. And I said, I see from your hat, you served in the military, you served our country, and thank you for your service, I said, my great uncle was a Tuskegee Airman. And he received the Purple Heart from George W. Bush. And the man's eyes lit up. And he took his hand out and he extended it to me. And I shook his hand, and he said, well, that's really great and wonderful. And I said, if you like, we can have a conversation. He said, no, this was good enough for me. And he walked off, right? But we have got to go into spaces where we don't feel welcome. And if we try to make connections and we stand for what's right, not for what's convenient, then that goes a long way in many cases in my experience.
So before we go to audience questions, if you could just say a quick word to this notion of intersectionality, right? So we have this multiplicity of movements, right? Me Too movement for March for Our Lives, movements to ensure and protect LGBTQ rights, movements to literally protect the bodies of young people in schools. But many of our movements are balkanized. And Mom, you spoke to the fact that many of us are comfortable speaking about our issues on our platforms, with our people, with our generation. As folks who represent religious communities, both institutions and lay, can you talk a little bit about the role of intersectionality in terms of how we frame issues, how we organize, and with whom we organize?
It's a very important question, thank you. The issues tend to be framed based on political expediency, in my view, or based upon actual needs of the events that happen. How we organize needs to be based on what will be the most effective way to bring about a resolution to the issue. I think, number one, we have to build wide coalitions. With the problems we have today, the significant challenges we have today, where major issues intersect with race, gender, and now, nationality. These are not issues that are suitable for one particular group or two particular groups or four particular groups. We need all hands on deck. But we need proper vision, and we need diverse perspectives on the issue. We need diverse answers, and we need diverse approaches. A one sort of universalized approach is not going to work. I think the solutions to our problems, in my experience, have been best met when we've had folks in the streets, folks in the back room, folks on social media, folks in the academy, all working together to solve this problem. And then you can be a person of faith person from a religious tradition who stands for a social justice issue and presents a solution to a problem that is not a faith-based solution, but it's a right-based solution, right? And so you can stand for, in my view, you can stand for what's right. You can have your faith perspective, but you can stand for a solution that meets everybody and gives everybody their equal rights and equal access, and advocate for that in the public sphere, so that everyone benefits.
Sure. So we wanted to allow at least 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So I'm going to let you have the last word on that question, and we want to open it up to the audience for your questions. There are mics to the left and to the right, and also at the balcony.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Jacoby Brown. I'm a member of the class of 1891. Feels like it was the last. It's been a while ago. Actually, I have a practical question. I'm a supporter of the National TPS, Temporary Protective Status Alliance. I don't know if there are any TPS holders in the room here. No? We're holding a national gathering on Tuesday, February 12th. We're looking for a place between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. that day, close to the United States Capitol, so people can come out of the cold, get something hot to drink, get some legislative packets. Do any of you know any location close to the United States Capitol where we could meet for that day?
You're welcome to join the offices of the Religious Action Center, Reform Judaism, 2027 Massachusetts Avenue. Michael Brown, you're a great organizer. You've been doing this a long time. Well done for people who don't know Michael.
There you go.
Brown.
The most easily answered question. Next question. Yes, please.
Hi.
Hi.
I was touched by your story of we thought that you needed to go to church versus we realized we needed to bring the church to you. And I organize with If Not Now, which is a very youth-based movement. So my question is, what is your advice or insight on how we make our movements intergenerational and really extend that hand to, many generations within our religious communities?
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Well, I think on almost any social issue, the young oftentimes feel it first because it surprises them. They have a sense of a country that's at peace, a sense of the country that's safe, and then that can get shattered. It can get shattered in urban affairs. It can get shattered in terms of our foreign policy. So young people oftentimes are the leading edge of what they feel about the issue. Broader, older settings are people who have been through it. You've heard several here. People who've been through it, who understand that you can be taken by the injustice of an issue and you feel impelled to respond to it, and you have a sense also, when you've been through it before, that this is going to take a lot of time. A lot of work, a lot of resistance, a lot of healing. And to some degree, you never want to lose the power and passion of young people who are coming to this issue for the first time in their life, whether it be race, whether it be war, whether it be poverty. You don't want to lose that edge, but you want to give them the support and the strength and the advice, even call it wisdom, that's going to help them to take a long-term view of the issue. Not because you're passive about evil, but because you're aware of the complexity of taking apart evil and restructuring it. So I think the young provide passion oftentimes first, and an older view may provide wisdom, and passion and wisdom together are needed for the long-term approach of dealing with the kind of complex questions this society produces. Because to go to Cornell's point, there are problems that are intersectional. That is to say, they're not one-dimensional, and you find yourself in connected issues. You need both passion and wisdom and age has something to do with distributing those things across a spectrum.
I think that the central question to be asking yourself as you're organizing is how you can share power. Ageism is interesting because it oppresses in both directions, unlike most other lines of difference. So we discard older people because we think that they're too slow. We discard younger people because we think they don't know what they're doing. And so this experience uniquely can be had on both sides of this conversation. But what I have found in our most effective moments of organizing and activism, we are welcoming people into the space to do what they do best and supporting them to do that. So whether it is giving advice or sharing the wisdom, or frankly, going to the folks who will listen to you most, right? Like there's a woman named Mama Cat who used to cook for all of us in Ferguson. She's an incredible chef. She also started an organization called Pot Bangers, which teaches culinary skills to homeless people so that they can work their way out of homelessness. But often when we needed some negotiating with an older generation, we sent Mama Cat, because that's a language that she understands. So she could operate in her power without us dictating the agenda, without us saying, go in there, say this, do this. Now, when it came to other kinds of organizing, when it came to organizing that was more social media heavy or whatever, that transitioned to other places. So I think that the question centrally to be asking yourself is, how do you share power such that everyone actually feels valued and valuable in the work that they can contribute?
Yeah. And I would also add, if I may, that when you advocate for a moral position, when you advocate for something because it's the right thing, and you protest, you go in the street, whether you're with 10 people or 10,000 people, that street becomes a mosque, church, synagogue. It becomes a sacred space. The streets of Ferguson are sacred spaces. All the airports across the country where protests were happening because of the Muslim ban, those were sacred spaces. Those were churches, those were synagogues, those were mosques. This gathering right here is a sacred space right now. Amen. Whenever you're protesting or talking about what needs to be done and speaking truth for power, those become akin to prayer in the Islamic tradition. You're speaking to the divine. You're speaking for change. Those become chants. Those become divine offerings, supplications. Those moments are spiritual, because when you're advocating with other people against oppression, against injustice, you are doing that not for any material gain, not for any worldly power. You're taking a spiritual moral stance, a prophetic stance. And wherever that stance is taken, that place becomes a spiritual sacred space.
Thank you. Take a question here, and then you were first? Thank you. I'm sorry, ma'am.
So we just lived through the experience of the Women's March, which was a very different experience on the national level than it was here locally in Boston. We in Boston really wanted to approach it as a very inclusive steering committee where we started bringing in people very early. And what happened on the Boston Common was that I, representing the organization that I run called JALSA, the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, spoke with Tanisha Sullivan, who's the president of the Boston NAACP here, to make a very clear statement that we were speaking together about our universal values to bring to the Women's March. But it also made us realize, I was speaking and I quoted Hebrew in front of 25,000 people, which is something I've never done before, but it also made us realize that most of the people we were speaking to were not coming to it from a particularly religious or faith-based approach. And as you are sitting here tonight and we're thinking about moral resistance, it makes me wonder, and I'm wondering your reaction, to the country really moving away from a faith-based perspective more and more as people start not associating with their religious values as much, and what's the role of religion in our continued moral resistance?
Thank you so much for that question, because I couldn't get to that question. In terms of the slice of American population who are non-affiliated is growing quite rapidly. roughly 1 out of every 5 adults, as opposed to mainline denominations whose attendance and growth is stagnant or declining. So your question goes to, well, what's the role of moral resistance and religious resistance in the wake of those numbers?
Can I jump in on
Please.
the point? And because there's the data, the statistics, and all that, and then there's what I witnessed in Pittsburgh, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to paint a picture of what I saw in Pittsburgh.
Please.
And my day job is moving the Jewish community into causes and alliances across lines of difference, so spending time usually outside of the Jewish community doing the justice work externally. But Pittsburgh was about kind of rushing into my people, my family, right, and being with the Jews of Pittsburgh. And here's what I saw. There were, after spending hours with the kind of leadership of the Jewish community and the mourners and all that, that first day culminated with that vigil, right? That gathering in a public institution. I can't remember what forum it was in. Thousands of people in the room, thousands of people standing in the halls, thousands of people on the streets outside. Students, the Jewish students who had gathered to mourn and grieve, but then to begin to take action together on gun violence, who wanted to caucus with me about what was the faith-based student-led movement to have sensible gun reform. And then in the room, the imam from the Muslim community stood up and said, to my Jewish family, we are here with you, we are mourning with you, we are prepared to stand guard outside synagogues to make sure that you are safe. And we've raised, into the time, $70,000, now it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, that the Muslim community raised for the Jewish community in Pittsburgh. And then a prominent African-American pastor stood up, named the pain of the Jewish community in this barbaric act of anti-Semitism, and named that and the particular Jewish suffering, and then named the Emmanuel 9 and the 2 black people who were murdered at Kroger's because he couldn't get into a church to murder black people in church, and then acknowledged that this synagogue was targeted by white supremacists because they were a highest congregation that was going to do work for the refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, and this white nationalist who's been ginned up by all of this xenophobia against migrants, was coming to save our people from them, and said, we here in Pittsburgh are going to maintain ourselves as a sanctuary community. And Muslim, Christian, Jew spontaneously stood and cheered and applauded. To me, that this was intersectionality. This was LGBTQ folk. This was brown folk, black folk, white folk, Asian folk, Muslim, Christian, Jew, people of all faiths and people of no faith. Was it religious? Was it secular? It was damn sacred. That's where God lives. And as long as we are actually showing up in people's lives for what's real and standing against the oppressive systems, then we will actually bring God into this space. And then I'm not worried about religious institutions and membership and all of that.
I echo that.
What time is service on Friday?
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
For those of you who may not be Methodists, what you just heard was a sermon and the benediction and the invocation.
Pass the offering.
All that. Pass the offering.
That's right.
Well, but I think the lady who raised the question raises a really good question, a good question to be asked at Kennedy School, because religious communities ought to be committed to justice, ought to be committed to inclusivity, but we're not the only actors. And in this society, a highly secular society exists, not only personally, but also in the way that people expect us to come together across lines. So I think there's a way in which, when I think of justice, I think of the passion of Isaiah, I think of the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the judgment of the nations, and I think of John Rawls, who doesn't speak that kind of language, but obviously if you want to think about justice, it would be good to read him for a bit. So the church or the synagogue or the mosque in this culture, so pluralistic, I think has to have the capacity to speak 2 languages. To speak the language of passion, to speak the language of love, to speak the language of revelation, and to speak the language of reason.
Right.
And there are different settings in which those different languages have different functions and roles. And so, as important as it is to think of what we ought to be as religious communities, it's also important to think beyond that, because the kind of questions we face and the kind of resources we need come from a place like this, as well as from the synagogue, the mosque, and the church. And that's a different language, it's a different logic, but it's not an alien logic, and therefore it raises that question.
Can I just say quickly from a personal perspective, right, beyond kind of the collective framing, I realized at some point that this work for me is a test of my faith. And not just because of the challenges, the immediate challenges and dangers that we have endured, but because I have to wake up every day and dare to believe in God for freedom, fully. I believe that God is a God of freedom. I believe that the God I serve is a God of justice. I believe that justice is fully divine. And yet there are so many ways in which I was operating as though I was trying to reach this thing called freedom or justice in a secular space because my spiritual connection wasn't actually going to be the thing to help deliver it. And I realized that that was actually not fair to the God that I serve. It was not fair to the faith that I espouse. I have been meditating on John 15 repeatedly. That is the only thing I have been reading for the last few weeks in my devotional. And it talks about the necessity of being connected to the source in order to bear any fruit. And that the point of bearing the fruit is not for your own glory or for your own prosperity, but for God's. And so if I believe that God is a God of freedom, and I believe that God is a God of justice, and the fruit that I want to see born is the fruit of justice and freedom, then I have to remain connected to that source in order for me to be effective in the work that I'm doing. So beyond kind of the collective scope of the work for me when I enter it every day, and people ask me this question all the time, they say, how do you square your faith with activism? It is because I recognize that the source is the person who put me in this line of work in the first place. And I'm trying to get to freedom to honor him and the divinity in all of the people around me.
Oh, thank you.
I want to pick up on something that Father Hehir said about youthful passion and senior wisdom as sort of an old person whose civic moral pilot light has been burning bright for decades. I have sort of a general question for you that I want to preface a bit. 50 years ago, my father was mayor of the capital of Michigan at a time when cities were burning, and I grew up in the civil rights movement. 40 years ago, I was a doctoral student here at the Graduate School of Education and worked with Superintendent Robert Wood on the Boston school desegregation case. So I was directly involved in reforming the system so that the federal court could withdraw. 35 years ago, when I got my degree, I was ushered into a realm by two Harvard deans of social responsibility and ethical investing. So I moved from the social and economic justice set of concerns affecting politics and institutions to social and economic justice concerns affecting money.
Okay.
And then since then, there's just been a series of activities, including a stint teaching at Harvard Divinity School as a postdoc. There's a big infrastructure out there in terms of faith communities that have been working for decades on reforming capitalism. And my question is, I know that a lot of what the conversation here has been about is the truth claims that emerge from different faith traditions and how they inform activism in the streets. My question is, to what aim might those truth claims be directed in reforming our capitalist system, which, by the way, speaking of vocabulary, the semantic similarity between theology and Wall Street are very much the same.
Okay. I'm not sure who's going to take the first crack at that question.
I mean, I would look to Dr. William Barber's Poor People's Campaign.
Yes.
Like, I don't even
Yes.
know that I am positioned to answer that in the way that he and all of the leaders in that movement are.
Yeah, I mean, if you heard Father Hehir reference the prophets and name them, in many ways, much of the religious tradition's gift to the world is an inherent critique of the gap between the rich and the poor, the structures of capitalism that have become oppressive structures. I'm a proud leader, a member of the steering committee of the Poor People's Campaign, and a dear friend of Reverend Barber. That is a fusion movement of folks across the spectrum that are trying to be about a morally just claim on the capitalist system as it exists. So that's, I think, core to who we are on some level.
It is core. I really, this gentleman has been kind of. So yours will be the last question, and we'll close out with a word from each panelist. So the responses will necessarily be brief.
Thank you, and I'll make the question brief. Thinking about intersectionality, many of us have been exploring the linkages between climate justice and environmental racism, and racial justice and economic justice. I would love to hear the thoughts of the panel on those connections, and also how we can effectively build movements that address all of them as an organic whole.
Okay, so that the forum ends on the same day it began. I'm going to ask each panelist to speak briefly to the question, but to also close out, if you will, with a benedictory note, if you will. That being an answer to the question, but also what gives you hope.
So I didn't understand. His question was about.
I think the intersectionality of movements.
Specifically around climate and environmental justice, linking to the other movements that have already been referenced.
Okay. So 30 to 45 seconds or so to a phenomenal question. Bryan.
Well, the last two questions simply illustrate that you have to have more than passion to get at these issues. Passion can carry you forward, it can motivate you, but at a certain point in a society like this, you run very quickly up against the complexity of the question. And that takes us back to the kind of different languages you have to speak. I mean, so to try to answer either of those questions would be intellectual suicide in this building. So the point is, they simply illustrate that we bring different kinds of gifts to deal with it, and passion by itself will not reform capitalism, nor will it connect environment and race. Those are complicated kind of questions. And again, for me, they're long-term and large, and you need more than one institution. You need religious institutions who need other institutions like this place. What gives you hope? For me, hope is the capacity to confront reality and not be overwhelmed by it. And the reality of the world of social justice and peace is so urgent and so exhausting that I have to depend on resources that are larger than me. So what gives me hope is faith, and faith yields hope, and hopefully faith and hope together yield a passion for justice.
Thank you. Jonah.
So, Reverend Brooks, you got to forgive me, but my publisher's standing back there saying,
there
hold up the book. If you're curious, Cornell William Brooks wrote a very beautiful preface to a book called Moral Resistance and Spiritual Authority. I happen to have a role to play in the book too. But the goal of it was to create spiritual fuel for this movement of resistance to the policies and the systems of oppression. And that's in many ways what does give me hope, right? Is that when Reverend Brooks put out the call to carry the Torah from Selma to Washington, D.C. in America's Journey for Justice, we had this idea that we could get some Jews to show up. And we put out the call and we thought, well, it's 40 days and 40 nights. It was a good biblical number. Could we get 40 rabbis, one for each night? And 200 rabbis of the Central Conference of American Rabbis showed up, which is 10% of all the rabbis in the Reformed Jewish movement. So we're living in a moment when, at least for my own people, I can say 10% of our folks, if you put out the call, they will just show up. And that was actually before the 2016 election, right? So I think we are living in a moment of unprecedented rage of children separated from their parents, the plague of mass incarceration, Me Too, and crushing oppression of LGBTQ folk. And we are just seeing citizen leaders from the youngest of the young, the folks from If Not Now, and youth-based movements, student-based movements, all the way up to the more veteran members of social movements who are just rising up and reclaiming what it means to be a moral America. So I have great hope from that movement that we are building.
Brittany.
In direct answer to the question, I actually reported some news on a report that came out a few weeks ago about the fact that of the top tier nonprofit and NGO organizations involved in climate justice, there's actually been a decline in the number of people of color in senior staff and board positions. So it is impossible, frankly, to solve environmental racism if the people most impacted do not have any power to make decisions about how that work is done. That same premise can be applied to resources if we look at the issues of Flint and the fact that young people like Mari Copley, who is 11, has to beg people on Twitter for backpacks and bottled water because her government stopped giving it to her. There's also an investigation that Mother Jones did about a year ago about some black congregations in the South that organized to protect their water resources. And it was actually companies in a capitalistic structure. It was actually companies and other religious organizations that sponsored a gospel concert in order essentially to convince these people to give up their rights to their land. And so we actually saw the perversion of religion in order to continue the scourge of environmental racism. So, and those congregations are certainly not receiving the kind of resources that our larger, mostly white-led climate justice organizations are. So I think it's a question of resources, and I think it's a question of ensuring that the most affected are actually leading the work, and whatever power you have to affect change in those two areas, I think is a great place to start. On the closing question, I actually saw a video that really challenged my thinking about this question just a few weeks ago, where a young activist said, the folks that are older than me keep telling me, I keep hearing them say that we young people need more hope, that they need to give us hope. She said, I don't need your hope, I need you to panic. She said, I need you to panic, and then I need you to do something about it. And I feel like the best way to instill hope in someone else that change can come is by showing them that it's possible. And so I am hopeful because I see us panicking. I see us getting proximate to the issue. I see us being urgent. But we need to remain as active as possible, because the only way actually to give people hope is to do the work.
Imam, thank you.
Thank you. What you said, Brittany, about the environment was powerful. I think racism is an environmental problem. And I think the problem with the environment is a race problem. If you ask, of course, from a fossil fuels perspective, environmentalism, you could argue, started way back perhaps in the Industrial Revolution. But racism, no. Racism goes far back in human history. And so if we cannot take care of each other, how in the world are we expected to take care of our environment? Because our neighbors are the closest ones to us in our environment. So the causes and the ills and the destruction to the planet is just a symptom of the human destruction that we are implementing on each other. And there will be, in my view, it's futile to look at a solution for climate change as long as we still have a race problem and a citizen problem, if you look at Flint, Michigan, and many other parts of the country. I think what gives me hope really are the words and actions of my late father, Charles Khalil Burris, who was the first African-American mayor of the city of Stone Mountain. And I saw him get elected when the KKK was walking down the streets, marching on Main Street, and used to burn a 50-foot cross on the top of Stone Mountain every year until 1996 when he was elected. And I saw him and was with him when he purchased the house of the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Stone Mountain. And I grew up in it, part of my life, and and talked with him about what made him do that and what made him run for office, and furthermore, how did he get elected? And long story short, he said he always believed that he could change hate into hope. And that, him being a student of the civil rights movement, a product of Ebenezer Baptist Church, went to school with Samuel L. Jackson. He believed that some change was possible and that his community could be a better community. And you go down Stone Mountain, you go to Stone Mountain, Georgia today, and it's a transformed community. And if that can happen in the seat where hate was born in Georgia, I am convinced that can happen in other places as well, and that each and every person has it within them to work together as stewards and members of a community. But we have to have it here, not here. And right now we have too much here, and not enough here. And I think, but the reality of that click, that transformation, that march you're mentioning, things like that, that is possible, and that's what gives me hope.
Wow. So first of all, let me just end the evening by expressing appreciation for this extraordinary panel for the Kennedy School. We want to take note of the fact that the Kennedy School represents the crossroads of ideas and policy. But those ideas and policies come into being as a consequence of the blood, sweat, and tears of activists and advocates across the country. Each of our panelists this evening have borne witness to the concerns that they have in terms of sacrifice, personal sacrifice. But these are also policy people in a policy place. So when we talk about policing, when we talk about the advocacy for LGBTQ rights, when we talk about voting rights, the jurisprudence of voting rights, when we talk about addressing climate change, we talk about policy, but we also talk about passion, we talk about commitments, and ultimately we talk about hope. And it is my belief that hope is not empirically demonstrated, it's morally chosen. Right. And so we want to end the evening by encouraging you to choose hope, choose policy, choose activism. See you in the streets. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Good night.